What do you think about the sort of eroding independence of the Fed with Trump pressuring Powell and then bringing Walsh in? And presumably Walsh is going to do, I'm sure they've had long conversations and he'll do whatever Trump really wants there.
It's just another extension of the mythology. The idea that the Fed is this all-important institution, which, by the way, is absolutely central to its policies. Its policies are expectations policies, which means you have to believe in it. I mean, the Bank of Japan's former government, the colorful Haruhiko Kuroda, back in 2015, gave away the game when he said, it's like Peter Pan. If you believe you can fly, then you can fly. That's what their policies really are. What they believe is, if you believe that the Fed lowering the federal funds rate, which is not an important rate to begin with, but if that somehow helps the banking sector, the financial markets, or the economy or something, if you believe that, and then you act on that belief, then you become the policy, which is, again, horse crap, because that's not how the world actually works. But in order for that to work, everybody has to believe the Fed is this all-powerful institution. So everything the Fed has done and how it has evolved since the 1990s in particular, and there's a reason why in the 1990s it started down this road, it has to maintain this aura, which is why we have these press conferences with Jay Powell standing up in front of the podium with that bank of flags, really impressive, and all the most major mainstream media asking him questions. It's a ritual. It is a religious ritual so that the Fed maintains this aura of power and capability, right? And so the idea of the Fed's independence falls under the entire paradigm, because, right, if the Fed's independence is threatened, that somehow threatens the mythology that has been built up around the Fed. When the marketplace where all of this would make it, if the Fed's independence mattered one bit, like the Treasury market would have said, "Oh crap, this is a big deal." We've heard about the Trump administration threatening the Fed's independence since last year. And we went through the same thing in 2019. People forget we went through the same stuff in 2019. The market does not care one bit, because the market knows the difference here, the difference between mythology and reality. If the Fed's independence is threatened, no one really cares, because it won't make a difference where it actually matters.
But you say it's horse crap, but like real markets do move when Powell says stuff. So you think that's just enough people believing the mythology essentially and trading on that mythology rather than actual reality?
Yeah, in the short run, absolutely.
Huh. Interesting.
You can line up, you can run any correlation you want between Fed policies and market movements. They don't last beyond the short run. Even QE, everybody thinks QE money printing led to the stock market going up. There is zero correlation between the Fed's balance sheet and the stock market.
See, I've heard you talk about this before, so I know your sort of reasoning there. But for anyone that's not, that might be a bit of a shocking statement. Do you want to explain why you think that?
It's not why I think that. It's what the numbers say. But there is this short run impact. And by the way, it's not just the stock market. The bond market fell for it too. If you look at bond market history, back to the early QE days, even Eurodollar futures fell for it, which is embarrassing. When the Fed first announced QE back in December of 2008, what happened? The opposite of what was supposed to happen, right? The Fed was going to buy a bunch of U.S. Treasuries. So which you're taught to mean, if the Fed's buying U.S. Treasuries, then Treasury prices should go up and bond yields go down. That's not what happened. Very first QE, bond yields went up, and they went up by quite a lot. And what that was the market saying, we believe this QE stuff might actually work. It might get us out of the crisis. So the bond market had a response. The stock market had an initial response, and then it got disabused of that notion pretty quickly. But in the short run, there are these psychological impacts where you think, well, maybe this stuff could work. And if it's going to work, then I certainly don't want to own a U.S. Treasury, because safety and liquidity is not what you want to own in a reflationary period. You want to own stocks. So if this stuff works and you believe QE works, you're going to want to buy a ton of stocks. Same thing happened in QE too. Bond yields went up rather than down, and stock prices certainly went up in August of 2010 when Ben Bernanke announced QE2. So there is a short-run relationship with perceptions of what the Fed could do, especially if these policies are new and untested, even though they had been tested in Japan. The idea was the U.S. execution would be different than the Japanese execution. But either way, there is a short-run impact where people think, maybe this stuff could work. I don't really know what it is. I don't know what it does, but hey, possibly it could work. The Fed is doing something big. Everybody's talking about how big it is. So maybe I'm going to buy some stocks and sell some treasuries because it could work out that way. But it never lasts that long, because in reality, that's not how the world really works. That's certainly not how the monetary system works. It doesn't work on Peter Pan belief. It works on actual money and monetary circulation more than anything else. So there are short run periods, and people only remember the short run periods. They only remember the times when the Fed announces QE and the stock market soars. They don't remember all the times when the Fed stops, QE and the stock market still soars, or when they're doing something different and the stock market does something different. So over time, there is zero correlation. There are short run correlations, but they don't maintain themselves over time because in a dynamic marketplace, markets are QE and the Fed's balance sheet don't really matter to the operation of intermediate and long term properties.
But during like COVID, when the Fed did print a bunch of money, forgive the, I know you maybe don't agree with that framework, but you know what I'm saying.
That's what everybody says. So, I mean, yeah.
But no one would say that the economy was in a good place while the world was locked down, like the real economy. But stock markets did soar. So is that not correlation?
But was that the Fed or was that something else? Was that just simple correlation? So I would argue that it wasn't the Fed at all.
What else would it be?
The federal government. It was the federal government reopening the economy, or at least creating a pathway to reopen the economy. That led to further second and third order effects, including the price illusion, which was really the price shock. So you had the economy that was shut down artificially, not for economic reasons, which allowed it to be reopened artificially, which led to a complete turnaround. So in 2020, it was slow at first and it really got going at the end of 2020 into early 2021. That wasn't the Fed printing money. That was the federal government reversing its policies, or at least creating a pathway to plausibly reverse its policies, and people reacting ahead of that.
Okay. One of the other questions I have around the Fed is like they've obviously got the dual mandate, one of which being jobs. Um, how are they
There's
going to
actually
manage?
three.
Okay. Well, will you explain that in the answer too? But how are they going to
Yeah.
manage that with AI seemingly starting to take jobs? I don't know if you saw, but Block announced yesterday that they're getting rid of nearly
Yep.
half of their employees. And
Which
I
is
think
not
that's,
AI though.
well, I mean, there's obviously a lot of people that say they hired way too quick in like 2020, 2021, and they had a
That's
lot of like a way too big headcount.
that's what Jack Dorsey said. That's what he said himself. He said, "Hey, look, we fell for the illusion too. We did what Amazon and everybody else did. We hired way more people than we needed. Now they're just blaming AI for the layoffs when it was really just being wrong about the economy."
But I think given a few years, I think AI will start replacing real jobs. And I think even though that may not be the only reason that Block have done this, I do think it's part of the reason. Like Jack has been, at the forefront with this like vibe coding revolution. Like, what do the Fed do if AI does start replacing a large number of white collar jobs?
Nothing. The Fed can't do anything. The Fed can't meet its mandates. Again, the Fed
They have to pretend to do something, though.
they have to pretend. That's really the issue, right? And so again, the mandates are full employment, stable prices, and the third one that people don't know about, which was forced on them in the 1970s because the Fed did not do what everybody said it was going to do, or what the Fed is supposed to do. That's not a thing, too. Just to digress a little bit here, I'm going to rant a little here. People don't realize the Federal Reserve was a joke for the vast majority of its history. That's not me saying it. That's the mainstream media, the marketplace, the banking sector, everybody, politicians. After the 1930s, the debacle in the 1930s, the Fed was relegated to the back bench. It was underneath the Treasury's thumb. And even when it so-called got independence in 1951, nobody looked at the Fed to do anything. It was basically left to try to manage Treasury auctions. That's what the Fed did from early 1950s to the 1970s. And then the Fed sat there, unable to explain where the great inflation came from, let alone stop it. So up until Volcker in the 1980s, even after the 1980s, it really wasn't until 1990 that people started to look at the Fed differently. And it wasn't because of anything the Fed did. It was because of the Great Moderation that showed up. And the Fed couldn't even explain why the Great Moderation showed up. But the point I'm making is this idea of the Fed being an all-powerful technocratic institution is a modern invention. It is something that was created largely out of the inability for people to explain where the Great Moderation came from. And so Fed officials, starting with Greenspan, but really Ben Bernanke was the chief one, started taking correlation and said, look, we evolved away from quantitative monetary measures in the 1970s and beforehand. We started targeting the federal funds rate. Maybe that's where the Great Moderation came from. So this ocean of prosperity in the 1990s was our doing through moving the federal funds rate around. And if you stop and think about it, you think about how ridiculous that sounds. But because nobody had any idea where the Great Moderation came from, and because it was such a unique period of prosperity, maybe it was the Fed. And so the legend of the Fed was born out of a singular instance in an otherwise long history of being a complete and utter failure and joke. So what we're really seeing is the Fed return to type here. It's just going, people are realizing slowly that the Fed is still the same joke that it was. It's just that it hasn't completely fallen into, it hasn't been completely accepted that way just yet, because there is still a lot of people who depend upon either having Jay Powell, the god, or Jay Powell, the villain, which is very useful to a lot of people, right? Why does the politicians keep the Fed around? Because when times are good, the president can point at the Fed chief and say, "I appointed that guy. He made the economy great. I'm a genius." And when the economy's bad, what can he do? Like Trump, that Jay Powell's an idiot. He's dumb. He's stupid. He's incompetent, right? The Fed is nothing more than a political lightning rod. So to bring this back to your question, sorry about that. With artificial intelligence, the Fed would, if we get higher levels of unemployment, I think they would be more measured in their rate. They would still bias toward lower rates, but they would be more measured, because what they would say is, look, this is a labor supply demand issue, not something that what they call monetary policy, can actually fix. Um, and then the price stability, again, not within the Fed's mandates. And the third mandate, which is stable interest rates, just to explain that, what the Fed has said is why they never referred to the third mandate. And it is required by Congress. It is in the law, the amended Federal Reserve Act. The reason they don't bring up a third mandate is because they say if we take care of the first two, by default, the third one takes care of itself, right? If we have maximum employment and stable prices, then we will have stable interest rates. So we focus on the first two, therefore we don't have to worry about the third. When everything that we've seen during these periods shows that that's not the case. We don't have stable prices, we don't have full employment, and interest rates, they are certainly not stable. And even 2010s, you could characterize the interest rates as stable, they're supposed to be stable at moderate levels. That's the word that's used in the statute. They sure as hell weren't stable at moderate levels during the 2010s. They were entirely too low, because low rates aren't stimulus, they're a reflection of conditions. So the Fed fails in every one of its mandates. AI is not going to suddenly help them. It's just going to add to their challenge.
Yeah, it's because one of the things that, again, you may disagree with this, but
The portfolio that performs in one economic regime can get crushed in the next. So in this free webinar, we're going to reveal what those four economic regimes are, how to identify them, as well as the assets, historically speaking, best positioned to perform in every environment. So reserve your seat now and learn how to prepare your portfolio before the economy shifts again.